Oh, you need me back.
Oh, I didn't know.
No, so it's fine.
Four, no, it's four. It's you and four more.
That's 13, 17. Do you count them?
I didn't know.
Depends on your fingers and toes.
Okay, so let's just begin by introducing ourselves to each other. So we'll start with Jane, row. Since some of you are new members and joining us for the first time for this time, okay? No, that's actually. No. Just stop.
Jane Brown.
Jane, very good. Your social security number, please.
Credit card? Janice Davis.
And how many, what are you gonna remember, Janice? A month. The negotiation process will start later, you know. You should have more negotiation.
Shelly Type. Louis Mortel. Gail Baker.
David Aldrin.
Rose Storch. Lynn Weinstein. Margaret Chapel.
Gavin Franklin.
Ellen Enders.
Richard Tyler. Steve Sebastian. Wonderful, so we have, I think, 13 here, 14 myself, and Eric, 15. That is, he's rolling in, 16. We have over so far 4 people online. So welcome everyone to this wonderful day, one-time course. And on the
Rabbi, use your headset, please.
I'm sorry. Welcome. Linda, hi, Fit. I have you come on down. You can sign in the sheet. Okay. Anyway, I'd like to welcome all of you. So, welcome to this class on the High Holy Day Prayer Book. And first of all, just to say welcome, and also to say that I have developed my next class, which you might have read about, which is going to be on God, and the God as experienced by our Jewish people through our history. So it's going to be 3 parts, and they are the October, the second, no, first, second, and third weeks in October, on same time, same place, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Thursday. The first class is going to be on God in the Bible and in the rabbinic literature. The second class is going to be on God in the Middle Ages and in the Kabbalistic literature, the mystical literature. And then the third session will be God in us. And hopefully each one of the sessions also will kind of reflect on them and talk about, hi, Doreen, come on, there's your seat right there. HighHolyDayPrayerBook. That they have to sign in. You can use anything you want to, Doreen. If you want to come up with an alias, it's okay. You know, so we should do that sometime and let Jane figure out who each person is. Anyway, so I hope that you're interested in that. And if you can think of another kind of a subject that you'd like me to teach as the year progresses, but we're doing this now and of course in October. And I hope that you will find that one very interesting. I find these topics not only hopefully the people who are attending find them interesting, but also I find it interesting, and particularly as you'll hear today, because I've never actually studied, maybe in rabbinical school, which is now 5 years ago, since God has taken a number of years. I studied it, but I found it very insightful and interesting. And by the way, there will be one part of the class which, if you find too disturbing for you, you're welcome to leave and come back. And you'll understand, because it gets a bit gory. Because the Middle Ages were no fun time for Jews. Well, no time.
Rabbi, your microphone is there. Yeah, that's better.
Okay. So everyone, we're going to begin with our bracha before study. For those of you familiar with the blessing, which is the word bracha, please join along with me, or we'll do it nice and slowly. Baruch atah Adonai Elohim asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu Please, we give you thanks, Lord our God, for commanding us to lasot, not just, hi Seema, you want to join us? take an hour off from work. Some examples of anyway, that's of course our wonderful SEMA. So anyway, means to be engaged with the study of Torah. And I've said this before, but I'll repeat myself. And it's not just giving thanks to God for giving us the opportunity to study Torah, but to be engaged with it. And certainly this is very much why I thought that this kind of a class would be very important at this time of the year, obviously, because in a couple of weeks from now, we're going to be engaged with this book, this red book that many of us are familiar with. And the question is, how can we be engaged with it if we have no idea what it's all about? It's number one, its history is very important. Do you ever wonder, when were these prayers written? Did Moses write them? I don't know, definitely not. Okay. Where do they come from? How do they come about? Interestingly, as you'll hear, some of it is clothed in mystery. No one knows, which you'll find is very interesting, especially when the main prayers behind holidays, scholars really are not sure who in the world wrote it and when it was written, which is very interesting. And so anyway, I'm going to today, oh, that's right, I have this. So as this is during the month of Elul, and every morning, every day you're supposed to sound the shofar, we'll give it a try. That was tough. Maybe some bourbon. Yeah, maybe having bourbon or something. Wow. Oh, by the way, we do have calendars in the back, fresh from Vitamins yesterday. So the fresh off the press here. I always say, I said this before, thank God for funeral homes, because without them, we wouldn't have calendars, obviously. But actually, I do like this one better than the other one that we got, because it has the Torah portions for the week. Some calendars simply list the day and Hebrew day, but they're lacking the portion of the week. This one has everything. Yes, that's why I like those better. Ones the publics don't have it, but don't no, but they don't have the Torah portion of the week. You sure? Sure. Like the ones last week did. Okay. So anyway, let's focus on this book. And to understand the prayers in Hebrew, whether we were to go to Anshe Shalom, I'm not suggesting going there, but on Yontif, if you want to go down the road to Anshe Shalom, which is a conservative synagogue, they have a different store, a different High Holy Day prayer book than we do. And certainly if you go down to Boca Raton Synagogue, you'd see a different one. And if you were to go around my corner and go to Beach to El Claire, and go to the shul there, which is you'd find a different prayer book. In all of these books, the prayers in Hebrew are the same, okay? But the English, well, first of all, obviously in B'nai Torah, which is Boca Raton Synagogue, which is Orthodox, not an Orthodox, they don't do English at all. Forget about it. Okay, that's all, they read all in Hebrew. But if you were to look in the English, because they do have English in the book, they simply don't recite it as we do, obviously, and down the block of conservative, the English changes. So people have said to me, well, what about? Shouldn't it be one English? No, because the English is a translation, and also not to go into our regular prayer book that we use for Shabbat, Mishkan Tefillah, where you have, in some cases, 3 or 4 different interpretations of the Hebrew. The Hebrew is the same. Obviously, the English translations or interpretations reflect upon the writer, or just different ways of looking at that. Our previous prayer book in Reform Judaism, Reform Mishkan, Gates of Prayer, had 12 Friday night services. Actually, I like that book much better than this one, but that's a whole nother story. And I had 12 different services. And why 12? It means 12. The Hebrew's the same. English, and that's because of the Lord this, the Lord that. There's another one which does generic, gender neutral language, So it doesn't call God Lord, but rather just God, which is gender neutral. And then there was another one, I forget which one, maybe one, number 4, which in my 30 years using up in Israel on Long Island, I never used that service because it doesn't mention God's name at all. This is the Reconstructionist service. So you're talking to the power that makes for my salvation. God is a power, a spiritual being. So anyway, this is the book we are now using, and some of you might be familiar. And that is, there's a new version of Mishkan Tefillah just for the high holy days. I happen not to like it at all, which is why I think there might be some of, I'm not sure if Rabbi Aviva wanted that one, I'm not sure. But I would even ask you to spend it all, it would cost thousands of dollars for the synagogue, for all of you to purchase them for just 2 days a year. As long as we're satisfied with this one, the majority of us, I've gotten to like this one. I feel comfortable with it. I hope that you do too. And if you ever want to know why I don't like Mishkan for the high holy days, particularly, I'll talk to you later, but I'll say the following. It revolves around how they butchered up the shofar service. And I don't understand, and no one understands except maybe the person who wrote it, why they did it that way. Anyway, let's begin. First of all, this book is called a what? Zor. So everyone say Mahi Zor. It's a chet, so it's the ch sound. One of the tests for conversion is if you can't say, forget about it. Okay, you can't be Jewish. Okay, Zor. The word Zor means to return. But obviously, every year returns to itself and begins again, is there a beginning to an end on a bicycle wheel? No, it's constantly revolving. And certainly our Jewish year, from one year to the next, time continues cyclically, to say the least. And so this is called a machzor. Our regular book that we use on Shabbat is called a what? What's the Hebrew word for it? Siddur, which means arrangement. The prayers are ordered in a certain way, and also here. So you don't have to look at the book yet. I'm going to give a little bit of a background, and I'm going to read some of my information here, only because this is something which I'm familiar with. It's something new for me. Okay. By the 9th and 10th centuries, keep that in mind. So 9th and 10th centuries, we're now in the 22nd century. What is it? 21st century. As Jewish communities spread across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, regional variations in liturgy and prayer books developed. So you're talking about at the time of Moses was the 13th century BCE. So you're talking about 2,300 years before what I'm talking about here. The 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. But the need for unified prayer texts for special occasions, especially for the high holy days. And I've stressed this over and over again. This is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are not holidays. They are holy days. Holidays in Hebrew is a very specific term for Chagim, which are coming up after Yom Kippur, 5 days later, Sukkot, of course, in the fall, Pesach, and then the holiday of Shavuot. Those are holidays, and not to get into a discussion about this, and that is Hanukkah and Purim, holidays, not holidays. And you might say, let's get to shul and let's have fun, or do whatever do you think we do here, or whatever you do here. But the fact is that each one of those designations affect the way they are observed within a more traditional community. They affect whether you can have a funeral on that day or not. They affect whether the rabbi can offer a eulogy on that day and if there's a funeral, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not getting into that. Okay. The earliest and the plural of Zor, if you think the word Zor is not easy to pronounce, imagine this. The plural is Zorim. Wait, I'll just say that book. Okay. Were crafted in these centuries. The 9th and 10th centuries is when this book goes back to. What does that mean? The Siddur, our regular Shabbat prayer book, goes back to the 1st century of the Common Era. This book, in the form that we currently have it, goes back, well, only 1,100 years, 2,000 years, which I found fascinating as well. And were crafted during the 9th and 10th centuries, comprising unique prayers, biblical readings, and what are called piyutim, which means liturgical poems. Poems were being written in different communities, which is why, for instance, if you were to go to a Sephardic synagogue, or you go to an Ashkenazic synagogue, if you were to go to a Romanish synagogue, Romanish are Roman Jews, Roman from certain parts of gypsy communities, the Jewish gypsies, they had other different poems, which were included in this prayer book. And why did you have to do that? aside from anything else, there's a spiritual nature. These are holy days, but also the fact what? If you're sitting in shul from 9 o'clock in the morning to, let's say, 6 o'clock at night, you got a lot have to fill it with a lot of things to read and pray. Okay? If you've ever been to an Orthodox shul, who have you ever been to an Orthodox shul on Yom Kippur? Did your feet start to ache you from all the standing when they repeat the confession of sins twice or 3 times? Oh my God! If you have deals with Marsha, take a prayer book on your way in, sign your sheet, and if you want to put an alias so we don't know you're here, and then take a seat next to Jane or anywhere you'd like to, or bring over a chair. Please sit at the table there. Okay. Yeah, it feels like it sometimes. Okay. Unlike the regular Siddur prayer book that we have, which contains their Sabbath prayers, the Matzor is dedicated to holy days only. Okay. And again, it reflects upon the various communities people want to live in. So it'd be interesting if, let's say, if I were to get copies of all the different types of prayer, my Holy Day prayer books, Matzor, and you can look at them and see the differences in prayers. You probably could, well, I was going to say a thesis, but I'm sure a thesis would be written. Okay. The medieval period was especially formative for the HighHolyDay prayer book. Leading rabbis and poets composed new prayers and piyutim. So again, you think, oh my God, it's 2,000 years old, or it was 4,000 years old and goes back to the time of Moses. No, this does not go back this far. Figures such as Rabbi Amram Gaon in Babylonia, who lived in the 9th century of the Common Era, the 800s, in Babylonia. Babylonia is where today? Okay, it was a major Jewish community today, unfortunately, but then. And then, of course, the great Rabbi Sajid Gaon, also in the 800s, in Egypt, played crucial roles in standardizing these texts. So this book, if you want to show how smart you are after the class today, and go up to someone at temple on Friday night and say, hey, how old do you think this book is? When are these prayers written? And they'll probably say, oh, 2,000, rabbis, a Talmud, whatever. And you say, no, sorry, the 800s, the 900s. Okay. The various rituals, again, Eastern Europe, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and there's so many others. Each one of them emphasizes something a little bit different, but they all, of course, center upon what? Again, these are holy days and not holidays. Also, what's very different from them, like Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot, they are not related to what? What do we not relate to whatsoever in these 3 days? There's no work exactly, as it says, and of course, Yom Kippur is called the Shabbat. Remember, we read that in one of the prayers, is the Sabbath of Sabbaths, so definitely no work. But also, Sukkot and Pesach and Shavuot relate to what? Harvest, seasons of the year. Now, granted, Rosh Hashanah will always occur on the first day of the 7th month of the year, which is Tishri, but the fact is, it has nothing to do with harvest. It has nothing to do with nature, although it's the birthday of the world, supposedly. Okay. The HighHoly Days, Rosh Hashanah, stand as the spiritual summit of the Jewish calendar, marked by awe, introspection, and solemnity. These special prayers are marked by and distinguished from the rest of the year. The text is not merely a guide to the service, but a vessel carrying centuries of Jewish history, theology, and poetic expression. There's a lot of poetry in particularly the traditional prayer book. Unfortunately, we in Reform are so concerned about being in shul too long. It's so much for me. We have to cut out a little. But if you want to really see some beautiful, beautiful poetry and expressions of a relationship with God and history, just get a traditional HighHolyDay prayer book at home with you and look through it on its own. Now, during the early centuries of the Common Era, and this is one of the reasons why you then would say, as Janice must be thinking, well, okay, this was written in the 8th and 9th centuries. The Sabbath prayer book was written in the 1st century, approximately 1st and 2nd centuries. So when Jews got together on the first day of Tishri for Rosh Hashanah for 800 and 900 years, what did they do? Now, the reason why we're not sure what they did was because what they did was not written down. And what was it? People got together and it was all, there was no fixed, was called liturgy. The word liturgy means the prayers. And of course, we have our liturgy. The church has its, the Protestant churches, the Buddhist, there was liturgies of all kinds. There was no fixed liturgy until the 8th and 9th centuries. Before that, it was all transmitted. So that all the early forms of prayer books, known as Siddurim, began to appear containing daily and Sabbath services, but it was not until much later that the High Holy Day Prayer Book began to form. So we're going to look at maybe five. Okay, 5 main prayers today, which I thought would be most interesting and are the most significant, because for the holy days. After all, think about it. Obviously, we're familiar with the Shema. We have Kiddush, although it changes a little bit in terms of the wording. We light the candles on Rosh Hashanah. We obviously don't do Kiddush on Yom Kippur. So, those prayers. But one of the prayers we're going to look at today, the Tana Tokef, 1, Kol Nidre, 2, Avinu Malkeinu, 3, and Vidui, the Confession of Sins, 4. And of course, there are very special readings from the Hi, Carol. Now take a prayer book before you sit down. Turn around. There they are on the bouquet, on the thing there. Now, see, we don't have faith here. Look at this. We have 1 minute. This is a miracle. This is a miracle day. Thank God you're all here. May you feel so good. Okay. So anyway, a large part of the prayer book is especially the morning service, is taken up by Rosh Hashanah and the blowing of the shofar, of course. Okay. Now, you might then say, how did the Machzor itself develop? Because obviously in the 8th and 9th centuries in Babylonia, as many of these prayers began to develop and become what was called codified or written down, what was in existence yet? The printing press. The printing press didn't come into existence to the 15th century. So if you think about it, go back hundreds or thousands of years ago, you had to be what? You had to be a very wealthy person to be able to afford to have a book of any sort, any books, okay? There were no libraries, so you couldn't do it, and there definitely was no internet, okay? The earliest printed Machzor appeared in Rome, I'll take this down, in the year 1486, okay? Eileen, if you have one from 1486, we can get a lot of money for that one. That is the earliest printed version, and notice what it's from. Now, Judy and I were in Rome 2 months ago now in June. I guess it was July, whatever it was easily, that's for sure. Leaving aside that, is that we went to the Vatican and saw their libraries. Oh my God, what they got there is absolutely amazing. And they might even have a copy of this original one. I hate to say this, it sounds terrible. I shouldn't say this, I know. They stole a lot of things, let me tell you. You go to the museum, they stole everything. The Romans stole it, the Greeks stole it, they have all this amazing artwork. If you've never been to the Vatican, you should put that on your bucket list. But do it, never go during the summer, okay? 1486, as printed spread, so did not. Outside of Rome, let's say northern Europe, Poland, there were large concentrations of Jewish communities, obviously, in Eastern Europe, as well as Western Europe, and obviously North Africa, obviously Israel. They began to get copies of these, but guess what? Once you start looking at a printed book, just like we do today, they'll say, seems right. I don't like that prayer. I don't like Leon. Let's see if the community likes it. Okay. So what began to happen was, so we were then printed with different commentaries, different translations, and you could put work into a prayer book as well. And some of them are very, very beautiful. Okay. So let's look at the prayer in the Tana Tokef. So let's take our prayer book. They'll go to page 106. Okay. Hopefully all of you are familiar enough with these prayers. To me, the Tana Tokef is one of the most powerful prayers ever written. If we look on the next page, which would be 108, of course, the well-known words, on Rosh Hashanah, it is written, on Yom Kippur, 108, it is sealed. How many shall pass on? How many shall come to be? Who shall live and who shall die? Who shall see light age and who shall not? I mean, it just really speaks to life because that's what life is. You know, literally, what should I say? I want to get too depressed, make you depressed here. I want you to walk away uplifted. But literally, life is what? And it's on a flare, right? Any moment, anything can happen to anyone. And we all know all too often people who one day they're fine and the next day they get a terrible diagnosis of cancer or something. One day someone's walking around, they fall. A number of people lately, as I've taken on the chaplaincy coverage at Delray Hospital in the trauma center, the number of people I met in the trauma center, unfortunately people in the 80s and 90s who fall at home and they fall in the head and the next day they're there and the next day they pass in the hospice. Okay, one, so to speak, and then next moment that's it, it's over. When scary stuff happens, and I don't want to get okay. It's so incredible. But the question is, what is the history? So let's go back to page 106. It was said that the words we are about to utter about my run of nights. We show died his faith might live. It shows that look up to the Shayom last proclaim the second law of this day. It is awesome and full of dread. Okay. Now you've read this, you've read many times either by the rabbi or by Lynn and Marina working on it, and the temple does so beautifully. But the fact is, I have to tell you, you know what fake news means? Okay. So let me share the following with you a little bit about the Tokef. This is a ute. This is called a ute. This is not a plan. It is a ute, which means a poem. It was written as a poem form. That has been a part of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur liturgy for centuries. It introduces the Yusha of Musaf these days. By the way, in Reform Judaism, unfortunately, I think while they lengthens the service a lot, we did away with Musaf. Musaf means an additional service. So in other words, if you've been to Anshe Shalom, for instance, there's a reason why the services on Saturday morning are over 3 hours. Because in addition to the regular tefillah, they had a second tefillah, which talks about the various sacrifices, offerings that were presented before God in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem when it stood. Okay. This, however, is considered to be the central poem of the High Holy Days. Now, the following is very interesting. It is recorded. Okay. It's recorded. Now, follow this for a second. It's very interesting. The development of these prayers. It is recorded in a 15th century work entitled Delray. Now, it's 13th century, that's the 1200s. A lot of it means it's a book on Jewish law, halakhic Jewish law. Okay, so it's not rabbinic stories and devices and made up things to produce lessons. And it's called the Orzaruah, which is attributed to an interesting person whose name was Ephraim Von, V-O-N-N, which I believe is probably in Germany. And he died around the year 1200. It's a problem a long time ago. Okay, now, I just want all of you to know, if this is too gross for you, then you're welcome to get them. This gets a bit, okay. Let me tell you, when Judy and I were going through our trip to the Mediterranean in Europe this summer, and we went to a lot of these churches and this saint and that saint and the other saint. To become a saint is barbaric. You really got to be fortunate, probably, and go through horrible stuff. Okay. Now, following. I found a manuscript by Rabbi Ephraim. Now, it doesn't say they found this manuscript, okay? So that's interesting, right? Okay, that one. And this is where we get this from our Bible, that a Rabbi of Mainz, Germany, about the terrible event which befell him, and these are his words. First of all, I'm not sure if he could have written it, as you'll find out in a few moments. Was the greatest of his generation and rich and pedigreed and handsome. And the bishop and his officials began to ask him to convert to Christianity, but he refused to listen to that. Thus they spoke to him day after day. He did not listen to them, so the bishop became angry with him. When they arrested him, he said, quote, I wish to consult and to think upon this matter for 3 days. Okay, stalling. Okay, I'd stall. Because the 12th century was a lousy time for Jews. Well, most centuries are, but those are okay. So he said it's only to later he was immediately consumed by guilt. He was important that he doubted the word of God and could be convinced to become Christian. In other words, he gave the impression that maybe he would convert, and now he felt guilty. I want to save myself and forget the guilt, okay? He went home and he was so upset by his failure to say he was converting, I'm a Jew, that he could neither eat, drink, and became ill. All of his friends and family came to comfort him, but he would not be comforted, saying, quote, I will follow my words to a mournful death. And he wept and his heart was bitter. On the third day, as he sat in pain and worried, the bishop sent for him, and he said to the bishop's soldiers, I will not go. The bishop sent numerous and distinguished messengers, still refused. Now the bishop ordered that he needed to be brought by force. And so he was brought to the bishop. This is where it gets really. He said to Anan, why did you not come to me at the time which was when you were appointed to come to me and answer and fulfill my request? Anan answered the rabbi, to be struck dumb, for the tongue which lied to you deserves to be severed. No, you shouldn't have said that. Let me tell you. You should have sanctified the name of God because of what he said. But the bishop said, I will not sever the tongue which has spoken so well, but I will cut off those legs which failed to bring you to me at the appointed time and mutilate the rest of the body. You hear this? The villain, the bishop, cut off his fingers and toes, joint by joint, and every cut he would ask, well, now you convert to Christianity? But he continued to reply, no. His last kiss was complete. I swear. Even bishop ordered that he be in the remedy of arms and no legs. No arms and no legs. He wanted that to be placed on a shield with his cut off fingers, severed fingers and toes beside him. He carried him home on this plate. Thus, it was called Amnon, which means to be, for he believed that mean, the Amnon means emunah, faith or belief, in the living God enough to suffer his terrible wounds for his faith and love, only because of the words which you have said. So that's it, it's a powerful leadership, obviously. When Shoshana came around, this like you can't believe this, but it's true. He even asked his family to carry him to the synagogue. With his fingers and toes. Right. When the kingdom reached the Kedusha, Amnon said to him, wait a moment, you have sanctified the great name of God, and he cried out, the time of Kedusha Yom, they sanctified your name in majesty and unity, quoting the words of our prayer. Do you believe this? It's a bit much, right? And that's what he said. So he continued with the entire prayer. So the whole poem was written in response to his horrible experience. When he had finished, he disappeared from this world right before the Lazo as he died. Out came the psalmist said, oh, great is your mercies and goodness, O God, for those who fear you. 3 days after, Amnon was taken to the Heavenly Academy. In other words, he died. And he appeared in a dream version to Rabbi Columbus, then Rabbi Meshullam, the Columbus, Moses, and Rabbi Columbus. It's ordered this poem.
That's you have best
In a dream, this Rabbi who was now dead, dictated with a kind of toe cap, the whole poem to this Rabbi Columbus. And then he was the one who wrote it down. So therefore, there are scholars who believe that Rabbi Columbus was the true author of this poem. And by the way, sadly, I hate to say this, because there was a disagreement of minds. Most importantly, this whole scenario that I just described to you, this boring experience, was fake news. It never happened, according to most scholars. Now, it doesn't mean it didn't happen to Jews, for sure. However, it didn't happen to him. So therefore, there are those who believe that Columbus was the author of okay. In those days, you can't get away with it today. Okay, it's called plagiarism or fake, whatever you want to say. You have to tell people you're making up this story as fiction. But if you were to say, "Oh, I wrote this poem with a time took Columbus," people would say, "Well, who are you? You know, big deal." Okay, but if you were to say, "Oh, it was dictated by this rabbi who went through this horrible experience that shows his faith. They said, wow, that's really very. Okay, now just to give you an example, just to give you a little bit fuller sense of all of this, who was the Rabbi Colonimus ben Meshulam? Okay, interesting. It was interesting. He was a French Jew. He was the head of the Jewish community of Mainz, which ultimately became, which was Germany, which did suffer terribly from massacres all over the place. So he definitely could have written this prayer. He is said to have sent a messenger to King Henry IV in Italy, in consequence of which the king promulgated an order throughout his realm to the effect that all Jews would be molested and killed throughout all of Italy. Nice times. On May 27th of the year 1096, however, Colonimus led 53 other Jews who had taken refuge from the Crusaders in the palace of Bishop Hildebert II of Worms in Germany to meet the invaders in battle during the Worms massacre. So in other words, there's real history that's going on, a very, very difficult and challenging time. So, Rosh Hashanah, I speak about this prayer, and I guess probably because it's written here, we'll read it as if it was about Rabbi Amban of Mainz. Now you know the truth, okay? He most probably died a martyr's death. But he and a lot of other Jews did as well. But this was probably written by a columnist who actually was very brave in trying to stand up for his people during the time when he lived in the 11th century, standing up for his people against these horrible crusaders, particularly if you've ever studied anything about the Crusades, they were, I mean, you know, well, I just described to you about this Rabbi Amnon, and unfortunately to many, many Jews, as well as, of course, Muslims as well. So any questions about that? Did you find that interesting? Yeah. Yes, Carol.
The Crusaders, some of them, well, why should we bother going all the way to Israel to kill Jews when we can kill them right here at home? That was a
Yes, to say the least.
not the only thing.
Sometimes it is.
They were supposedly going to fight Muslims, but they found it more convenient and like what they're used to kill some Jews on the way.
For sure. So anyway, I found that again, I enjoy doing this. People say, well, why do you teach? There's many reasons for teaching, just in terms of sharing one's own knowledge, etc. But in a subject like this, which I've never really researched before, I find new things, unknown things, and I certainly had no idea about any of this. But what it does is it makes these prayers biblical, because it's written by people after their lives, of course, in this case, going back to the Middle Ages and what. Okay, so our next one is going to be the well-known prayer of HighHolyDay. So we're on page 251.
Amputation, extremity. Did they have them how to stop the bleeding?
Well,
Getting it done.
I guess, well, they probably cauterized it with coals and they made it more miserable. What can I tell you? I didn't go. When Judy and I were on a cruise from Los Angeles through the Panama Canal on the way to Miami a number of years ago, and we went to Cartagena as one of the stops. Did you go to Cartagena? They had there the Museum of the Torture of the Catholic Church during the Inquisition. And Judy said, oh, you want to go? I said to Judy, you want to go? She said, oh. I did meet people from the ship. It was, I forget, I guess it was Royal Caribbean or something. But anyway, I did meet people on the ship who went to that museum. And they said they had to walk out after a while. They just could not take. We as human beings, I'm even just talking to generally, and what. And by the way, don't forget, September 16th, being an extraordinary speaker here, Dr. Alex Cord, on a Tuesday night, whose mother was one of the Mengele twins who experienced the experimentation on twins that the evil Mengele did. He shouldn't rest in peace. So anyway, we can think of horrible ways to do things to people. And how the Catholic Church, they torture people all kinds of ways, but how do they keep them alive? Yeah, so I guess from cauterization again, doing that in an honorable way as well. You're better off dying immediately and not just going through all this. What, there's no purpose, obviously. Okay. Delray, yes, we all know the prayer very well. I'll never forget during my first holiday pulpit, my holy day pulpit, okay, holy day pulpit. I was at our Sinai Temple in Trenton, New Jersey. Anyone here from Jersey? Trenton? Okay, okay. Anyway, I was 24 years old, and it was a overflow service of 300 people in the basement of this very large Reformed synagogue in Trenton, New Jersey. And in those days, cantorial students could still be in high school, and they were taken to Hebrew Union College, obviously, after hours, whatever, to learn the cantorate. And so there was myself, a young person, to say the least, and this young cantor. Well, after the first Rosh Hashanah was over, at Rosh Hashanah, people, and I of course could see this, whenever the cantor sang, he was terrible. People actually holding their ears like this, okay? He was so bad, really. So the president of the synagogue came to me afterward and said to me, "Can you sing?" I said, "Well, I can sort of sing, okay. Are you willing to be the cantor and rabbi next week?" And they let the poor young man go. I don't know. So anyway, I'm going to call Delray in 1 week. So anyway, 1 week and I could make my way through it. I needed to do that. Thank God we have cancer share now, and thank God I don't have to. And a wonderful Temple Sinai. Okay, now, Kol Nidre. Kol means all Nidre, my vows. You're familiar with this book, certainly. By the way, the word Kol Nidre and the entire paragraph thing is written not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic. Aramaic was the spoken everyday language of Israel, of the middle of that part of the world, 2,000 years ago, when most probably this prayer was, well, it wasn't written, as you'll find out. Okay. But anyway, that was the language that they went to. Now, it is a written an Aramaic declaration. It is not a prayer. Again, notice now, Unatana Tokef is not a prayer. By the way, what? Is the Shema a prayer? Is it the Ahata prayer? No, you're not talking to God. You're saying what? Hear, O Jane, the Lord our God. The Lord is, we're talking to you, O Israel. We're talking to each other, right? If God knows God, only if God knows God is one. You have to tell God you're one. God knows God is one. So that therefore, these are not prayers. We're talking, that's why the tefillah, right, is when we're talking to God. The rest of the service, much of it is what? We are inspiring ourselves in various kinds of ways. So therefore, it is an Aramaic declaration. And it's a ceremonial accompaniment. Of course, Kol Nidre is magnificent. It is considered to be the centerpiece, although actually the centerpiece for many Hazanim, for many cantors, is actually Hineni, which is the first piece that's sung on Erev Rosh Hashanah. However, today is they really work so hard. Kol Nidre, that and the choir, of course. We have a cello accompanying us to this cello, right, Lynn? Maybe?
Yeah.
Maybe clarinet. I have my clarinet.
A string instrument.
So a string is okay, no clarinet. Lynn, I give you an idea. Imagine an electric guitar. What do you think?
No.
Some younger people here. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, Kol Nidre is a magnificent musical piece. Obviously, people would say it's like, didn't Moses write the Shema? Yes, well, okay. God knows what Moses even spoke. He probably didn't speak Hebrew. He spoke probably an ancient language called maybe Ugaritic or something or other. No one knows what he spoke, but definitely wasn't the Hebrew that we have today, that's for sure. So I'm sorry I upset anyone here like Janice. She has this look of it. Okay. But the fact is no, we didn't speak Hebrew as we know it today. However, the fact is, you have all of these musical renditions, and during COVID times, I call them COVID times, like the Middle Ages or medieval times, where you go to that place up in Orlando by Disney Renaissance times or something. We have dinner and stuff. in the show. Anyway, during COVID times, I made a mistake, most Kol Nidres, and because you go on a TV, and one Kol Nidre, I listened to 4 Kol Nidre night. I listened to 4 Kol Nidres. I went from one service to the next service to the next service. And it was interesting hearing the different cantors and their renditions. Especially, let me say, Park East Synagogue was amazing with Ozzie Schwartz, where the first, and you're supposed to, some of you might say, thank God we don't do that here. Doesn't make the service much longer. But you're supposed to traditionally sing Kol Nidre 3 times, okay? Not just once. So Ozzie Schwartz, who's an incredible cantor, sang it 3 times. The first time by himself, the second time with a piano or an organ accompaniment in the sanctuary. Remember, this is conservative. And the third time, I'm not sure how he did this, he actually had a small orchestra in another room somewhere. And I don't know how they brought this, I don't know how this happened. Logically, boy, Eric, see, you think you have it challenging here. Imagine there. But there you're actually getting a salary probably for doing this. Yes. And Eric's shaking his head, yes. Okay. Now, the common text of Kol Nidre that we, which is, by the way, on page 252, these words, as I mentioned before, are Aramaic. Kol Nidre, v'yasarei, v'nachonei, v'konomei, v'kinoi. And one of the reasons, and by the way, one of the most well-known of all of our prayers is called the what? Kaddish. The Kaddish is not in Hebrew either. It's also in Aramaic. And one of the ways you can, if you're not really knowledgeable in Aramaic, this is obviously very similar to Hebrew, but there are differences. One of the main differences is not so much here in this prayer, but if you notice in line number 2, for those of you who do know Hebrew, you'll notice that the last 3 words all end in an aleph. That's the same as a hey at the beginning of the word in Hebrew. Aleph at the end of a word, and hey at the beginning of a word means in English, the. Okay. So, for instance, if we were to turn to Kaddish, which we're not going to, you notice many of the words end in aleph. One of the ways you can tell Aramaic versus Hebrew, because in Hebrew would be a hey at the beginning of the word and no aleph at the end of a word. Okay? So you learn a lot today. See that? That's amazing. You could definitely win a trivia game on HighHolyDays. Look after today. Being Jewish. Yeah, Jeopardy, right. Exactly. So anyway, it's the following. The earliest known text, again, the earliest known text, it is not a 2,000-year-old text. It was not being, why? Because it just wasn't. We don't have any record of this going back 2,000 years ago when the rabbis of the Talmudic period were writing the prayer book. The Kol Nidre text appears for the first time in a very important prayer book of Rabbi the prayer book of Rabbi Gaon, Gaon, who died in 875, not 1875, 875, again, the 9th century. So similar to what I was saying before about this prayer book in general, Rabbi Gaon's Matzor is really the first one ever invented. There's still another 700 years to get a printing press. But it's the first time that all of these prayers could be found in one volume in his book. Now, does it mean, therefore, what does it mean? That different communities, there might be some communities that have the Kol Nidre. After all, Aramaic was an ancient language, so most probably it was around for a long time. And there were variations in the prayers. So I just wanted to share that with you because I thought its history is very interesting. And unfortunately, it was misused, certainly during the Middle Ages. Why? Because some people said, well, I can't trust a Jew, right? How can I trust someone who gets up every Yom Kippur and says all the promises and oaths that I made during the previous year are now a null and void? Okay? By the way, make sure you read my message this week, which talks about this, okay? Yeah. So guess what? It created a problem for Jews in many cases. Because they said, how can we trust someone who's Jewish? We can get up and say that. But obviously what the prayer really had to do with what? It had to do with when we were forced, similar to what? Again, the Middle Ages and other times as well, when we were forced to, let us say, convert or do other things rather than continue with our faith, like the sad story about that rabbi. And the fact is that therefore we were forced to, let us say, in some cases, convert to another religion rather than die, be murdered, and therefore we ask God to forgive us of those things. And Maimonides, the great Maimonides, which was my class last year, wrote a marvelous letter to the Jews of Yemen, because the Jews of Yemen during the Crusades were being forced to convert to Catholicism. And they wrote a letter to the great Maimonides, who was living in Spain, and wrote a letter to him and said, what do we do? Because according to the Talmud, it says for three things, we should give up our life rather than do these three things. These are three of the most inviolate actions. One is if someone comes up to you and says, you see that person over there? I want you to murder him, kill him, otherwise I'm going to kill you. You're supposed to, under Jewish law, say, take my life instead. Why? Because it says in the Talmud, how do you know that that person's blood is greater than yours? In other words, how do you know that person's any worse of a person than you are, especially if you don't even know the person? Okay. The second thing is, if someone comes up to, let us say, a man and says to that man, you see that woman over there who wants you to molest her and rape her, otherwise I'm going to kill you. You're supposed to give up your life rather than do that. And so those are very, you can understand them. Obviously, the Talmud goes into all kinds of instances and variations on these. But the third one is the really very interesting one. And it says, if someone comes up to you and says, I'm going to kill you unless you convert to another religion or you worship idols, statues, etc., it says in the Talmud, you're supposed to give up your life. But as time progressed, and Maimonides certainly stated this in his letter to the Yemenite Jews, and said to them, no, you should be willing to convert to another religion, and when you are able to leave that culture and return back to your Judaism. And certainly there were many Jews over time who did that, and certainly even during the Inquisition as well. It was pointed to us when we were in Barcelona in Spain, and for those of you who've been there, you know that where this Inquisition, of course, was very prevalent during the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries, that you had these Jews, we call them Moranos, who became secret Jews and worshiped in various secretive ways to continue their faith, but outwardly converted to Christianity, unlike Rabbi Amnon, and give up their lives. So it was interesting. So Kol Nidre is related to all of that. Okay, the next one we're going to look at is Avinu Malkeinu. I've actually one, two more. So Avinu Malkeinu and then the Confession of Sin. So Avinu Malkeinu, we can find on one of them is 121. And again, I'm not a cantor, I'm so musically knowledgeable to say where the melody comes from. If there are many, I call one, what was it? I can't even sing it offhand. I call it Barbra Streisand's melody. Which Cantor Shear is going to be doing for one of the times. But of course, there's Avinu Malkeinu, no, Moses did not write this melody. It's probably very recent. Okay. Avinu Malkeinu is a Jewish prayer recited during services, obviously. Since the 17th century, most European Ashkenazic communities recite it also on all fast days. So in other words, it is an ancient prayer. There's no specific date to it, but certainly we have to go back. The only time we would know about it, again, is this prayer book of Rabbi Gaon of the 9th century. Before that, we had absolutely no idea. No idea when these prayers were said, written, or used, or even who wrote to them. Okay? However, one thing is for sure, as Rabbi Joseph Hertz, famous for his Hertz Chumash, who died in 1946, who was the chief rabbi of the British Empire, described Avinu Malkeinu as the oldest and most moving of litanies of the prayers. It makes use of the titles of God, and that is God, Father, as well as our King. By the way, Rabbi yes, the apologies. Good luck, whatever. Okay. What's interesting is that in this prayer, we do have an earlier indication of it, according to my research, and that is Rabbi Akiva, a very famous and well-known Talmudic rabbi who died in the year 135 of the Common Era. He died actually tortured. He was one of the many rabbis who were tortured by the Romans during the Roman revolt, the Jewish revolt against Roman occupation of Israel at that time, right? So he died in 135 of the Common Era in the Jewish revolt. But he died reciting the two verses of Avinu Malkeinu. Okay. And a much later compilation of Talmudic notes published in 1515, there's an expansion of these verses to what we have today. So there is a somewhat of a history going back. That's a really very ancient and old, much older prayer, one of the few that actually can track its source to the Talmudic times. And of course, what's beautiful about Avinu Malkeinu, and now if we look on page 271 to the Al-Chet prayer. Avinu Malkeinu, of course, is said in the what? In the plural. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, the King. Okay, so it's our. So even though there might be some people in the congregation who do not necessarily see God as Father, King, etc., we say it all together. The same way in the very famous vidui, which is the Hebrew word for confession of sin, on page 271, and goes on and on and on, and various different interpretations and variations, they're all said right in the plural. So you might say, well, you know something, I never committed this sin. We're not asking you to give personal testimony. We're covering up for each other. Okay? And there's a lot of power in that. I'm sure you've heard this before, right? It's all said in the plural. There are, of course, not the Jewish that I know of, but there are in Christian communities where there are testimonies where people get up and say, I committed this sin, praise the Lord, forgive me, God, you know, that kind of thing. We're not asking for personal witness, giving witness or testimony. However, we therefore cover for each other, so to speak, and simply say it in the plural through the confessions of sin. And by the way, Judaism does believe in confession of sin. And actually, a form of this vidui is recited every single day of the week in the morning, the traditional morning service. And it can be done in various ways. There's a prayer section at the very end of the traditional Shacharit morning service called Tachanun, which means petitions and pleading before God to what? Forgive us of our sin. There's actually a ritual called the Filat, the falling down or the drooping down of the face. I was, as most of you should know, Janice might not know my whole history yet. She'll learn it. However, I was certainly brought up when I was brought up ultra reform. Okay, so a lot of these things I learned as I experienced things during my life. So I remember one time I went to this Orthodox synagogue on the corner from where I was staying in Jerusalem. After our group went back, I stayed for a couple of days, and I noticed something really weird. When they came to this ending part, the end of the morning service before the final confession, I noticed everyone like this. It's nappy time, okay? What's going on here? Actually, that is a ritual called the Filat, the dropping down of one's pamim, one's face. Because you are this morning, oh God, I feel like I am nothing. Give me of my sins, I've sinned before you. So it's actually now in a sense of rather than prostrating, not prostrating, prostrating oneself on the ground, which you could do, you would do this. And all the males, and that was obviously male, would do that. And so there's a whole history to that ritual as well. It's called the Filat. The Filat means the falling down, the bringing down of one's punim, his face. Did you know that, Trudy? Yeah. It's done every single day, except 2 days. The Thursdays when Torah is read. In those days, you're not allowed to plead for your sins because you're studying Torah and you want to be uplifted, not be, oh, so sinful. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So so there are confessions of sins out there. I don't know, maybe some of you have said this jokingly, some of you might have meant it. You say that you have a bad thought and you do something wrong, you say, it's okay, I still have 7 months before Yom Kippur. Okay, that way. The humanity said, repent 1 day before your death. So don't wait until Yom Kippur because you might not make it. Okay. And the fact also is that we do have a before death. There is a confession of sin before death. Within a traditional community, that would definitely be the requirement. There's some versions of this which are quite long. There's some shorter. If a person could say it himself or herself, that's fine. If not a person visiting, the person could say it for them. Yeah. And the tradition does say, by the way, is that if a person confesses their sins before they die, then their sins are erased. And that becomes very important. And that was on my other classes from last year, because we do believe, as my Maimonides instructed us, we do believe in life after this one. And the first place you will go to is Gehenna, to hell, to be judged, and ultimately, of course, before those of us who are better rise up to Gan Eden, which is the Jewish version of heaven. So you want to make sure you can be forgiven as many sins as you can before you get to that situation. Okay? So anyway, that would be, of course, you can see then in Kol Nidre, as well as the Vidui, they're written in the plural for that reason. And by the way, it's very interesting, the variations of all of these things. If some are, and I don't like the one, I forget what is Mishkan. I'm not sure if they do translate Avinu Malkeinu as our Father, our King. As you can understand, there are many who feel that our Father is certainly not gender neutral. Okay, so they'll say our parent, and the king, because the king is only a man, so our ruler, our parent. I know, I'm used to our Father, our King. There's a feminist law that says our what? Our mother, our queen. I don't mean to diminish any of that because I'm not in someone else's shoes. But I do remember that, I forget which Holly it was. This goes back 50 years during the feminist movement, Gloria Steinem and all that. In those days, there was a rabbi, a female rabbi, who was invited up to Albany to do it before the state legislature. And rather than saying men at the end of the service, she said, women. In the 80s, which was the height of all this here in the country, at the end of a wedding ceremony, the breaking of the glass. And many times these women would say to me, the bride-to-be, would say, well, I don't break that glass. Okay? I said, well, the tradition is the male breaks the glass, but do you want to break the glass? She said, yeah. So one ceremony, I had 2 glasses. I said, okay, 1, 2, 3, both of these have a glass. But the one that I really love, and this really tells you something about their relationship, I put the glass down, put his foot on top of the glass, and she stepped on his foot to break the glass. What is that? You think that marriage glass? It tells you who's in charge, right? Yeah. She was letting him know. And on the other hand, I remember early on, I was doing, I think it was a 25th wedding anniversary, which to me, they looked very old. I'm sure I'm a lot older than they were then. Anyway, I was in my 20s, and it was in Brooklyn. That's right. She said, Dave, those of you who remember Brooklyn, okay? And it was very cute because she came down to the aisle, came down to the chuppah, and the song that she selected was "There's a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight." And she's a really cool, woman, etc. And anyway, they get up to the chuppah, and I do the ceremony and whatnot. And it's getting toward the end of the ceremony, and he said, "I have the microphone for a moment." And I said, "Sure." You never know when you give someone a microphone. And he said, "Well, I just want everyone to know I'm going to be breaking the glass in a moment. That's the last time I'm going to be putting my foot down in this marriage." So I even told David, Shear's husband, just to know that that's true. That when you break that glass that day, that's going to be the last time you're putting your foot down. As I tell many of my young couples and older couples, there's only one person in marriage who's right 100% of the time, and that ain't you. It's the wife, right, ladies? That's it. And if you understand that, you'll be happily married for a very long time. I can give testimony to that. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this program about the Matzor. And of course, we could read through many other parts of it. And certain prayers, like I mentioned, Kiddush changes the end to include the holiday, the holy days. the holidays later on with Sukkot, and obviously candle lighting is always changing to be specific for the day. But these are the main prayers that really stand out. And you can see, we can't assume that this is ancient, because we don't know what the ancient rituals were really. Because you can think about it, we say, oh, this has always been, okay? It's not so. And unfortunately, and I guess it sounds like a criticism of traditional Jews or Orthodoxy, they give you the appearance that this is the way it's always been and always will be. It's not so. There were very, very creative periods in Judaism that brought this into being. And there, of course, are still within modern Jewish communities also creativity going on, creating new prayer books, and certainly cantors can tell you all the new melodies that are coming out, which I know a lot of us here are. We don't want new melodies. Don't shake me up. I like the old stuff. Well, the old these take place lower sometimes for the new, because that's how Judaism stays alive. As we all know, a snake has to shed its skin in order to continue its life, right? Lynn, do you have a question? Eric, you have a microphone?
Microphone,
Who has one? Okay.
I got it. There.
Exactly. Well, think about this for a second. Before the printing press, I mean, this is what the back. I mean, we talk about the internet and now roll. By the way, you can buy Meta, Meta Zuckerberg, whatever his name is. Nice Jewish, well, I'm not nice Jewish boy, little Jewish boy, Mark. Anyway, Meta is now selling your own personal robot for your home for $6,000. Okay, and it'll do everything for you. Everything. Anyway, someone told me last week that they're actually creating a robot that can give birth. They're able to have an artificial womb. They're able to put an egg and sperm into the robot. What else? What was it talking about? Oh, yeah. Anyway, the printing press was an extraordinary invention. Okay, it's like the computer columns. Yeah, the 1500s, right? Yeah. Well, by the way, I had the opportunity of holding one of the copies of the Gutenberg Bible when I did a program in the summer for the New York Public Library System. And I also, I had one of the copies, and also Shakespearean folio as well. But anyway, is that I mentioned before that, yes, Linda, of course, someone would write the prayer book, right? They did, and then someone else would write. But how many copies do you think there were? 100, maybe 50? And then therefore think of how precious it is for someone to get a copy. And it's not like my library, which is expanding exponentially every minute there. Today, what's happening in the Jewish world today has never happened before. The number of Jewish books of real content in Hebrew and in other languages has never occurred in the history of the Jewish people, okay, because of technology and the ability to do this and to distribute it. Amazon, where the online bookstores is absolutely amazing. Never before, which means more Jews today become learned Jews than the history of our people ever. But think back 500 years. How many had these books, right? And what, 600 years or 2,000 years old? How many people had them? Well, that's the other part. Yeah, well, the first part of it, was, you want to say something? Yeah. Well, the other part of it is you have to have people so they want to be as distracted as we are, okay? So that their minds can be more focused on memorizing. How was the Talmud written? Okay, it wasn't written down initially. It was what? You have someone who was able to, just like you have people with photographic minds, there were people who had audiographic minds, and they're able to hear something and within a short period of time write it down word for word. And they were called in Hebrew, it's what they call the Choser. These were very, very valuable people. Without them, we would not have almost any of the Jewish sources that we have. Lynn first, and then understand.
Speaking about doing mitzvot, and you know that there are certain mitzvot that we hold on to. They're so holy, like very but also how us here. I'm likely to write our own time. But at the same time, there isn't no Torah being written. You're invited to just write one thing on that newspaper.
Definitely.
That is an engagement.
I'm most definitely sad. Yeah. There's a contest in the Muslim world. Okay, where young men think it's the one that has to do it. Okay, they memorize the whole story. Oh yeah, and then they quiz on actual word by word on the whole story. Yeah, but to do it, and I don't know, but it was a woman that was allowed to do it. Yeah, well, that when you speak to Muslims and you're on a certain occasion, they will quote certain parts of the Quran. And by the way, they're required. Whenever I didn't understand this initially when I started working with the Muslim community on Long Island. But we invite them to, let's say, a ceremony or something, and I'd say, "Would you like to give the invocation?" So they give the invocation, but before they offer in English, they first chant it, in Arabic, and then they give the English. And some of us within the Jewish community in particular were very offended by that. Therefore, any prayer I do, I don't first do in Hebrew and then in English, or Aramaic and then English. I just do it in English, so it understands it. I found out that they are required by Islamic law. They cannot utter any translation of the Quran before offering it in the original language. So they have to memorize it. But think about it, and I'll stop there because it's getting late for some of you, for some of us. But imagine again, 5,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, you had these people who were able to memorize things and then slowly, obviously, I mean, you're not taking notes, write them down. And Jose was very important. For matter of fact, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who died, I think, in 1976, I think it was. Anyway, he had his Jose, who died about 3 years ago. And he continued that same, even though in the 1970s you didn't have to, because you could record things, he had a person who would actually listen to the lectures and then write them down, then go back to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and ask him, did I do the correct thing? So for instance, I don't have all the volumes here now. Hopefully I'll get them by the end of the next turnaround with New York. But I have 15 volumes of all the lectures of Nachman of Breslov, who's a Hasidic rabbi living in the middle 1700s in the Ukraine. Okay, so the question is, the one who wrote these was a Nathan Ginsburg. Okay, so the question is, how did he write them? Do you think that he sat there with a quill and an ink thing? Okay, wait a second, Rabbi. I didn't finish that word yet. Wait, could you repeat that? Well, you can't do that. Over 2,000 pages in these 15 volumes of every one of the lectures of Nachman of Breslov. Because Reb Nathan, I visited his grave also, Nachman of Breslov's grave a number of years ago. He had what? He had an audiographic mind. And so he was able to listen to these things and then write them down and then go back to the Rebbe and make sure that this is what he said. You get a little bit of a problem here later on. So for instance, one of the greatest of rabbis in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism is a Rabbi Isaac Lurie, the Ari as he was called, in the 1500s in northern Israel, in Sfat. And he wrote down nothing. It was all verbal. But his great person was Chaim Vital, okay? And Chaim Vital wrote down the lectures. But the question is actually whether Chaim Vital wrote down what he heard, or was he writing something new? And there's a lot of discussion about that. As well as, of course, he could get away with it because he stated that he was the reincarnated Ari, the Isaac Luria. You can get away with that then if you're the reincarnated person. It gets fun, it gets complicated. Anyway, the Machzor is an exciting book. I hope that when you're here for the holy days, that you as I, that this is a vehicle to express our hopes and to deal with our concerns and fears that we have for the year to come, asking God's blessings. Of course, be sure as a community of hope and of faith, that's what we have to be, that's what we are. But also understand that it was written by not God, but by people in their experiences just like us, calling out to God and dealing with difficult, and in some cases, of extreme times. And the High Holy Day Prayer Book speaks about this in the most incredible way. So when the Tana Tokef called Delray were written literally during traumatic moments of Jewish life as they faced their experiences, but we do also. So anyway, thank you everyone for doing it. And as we say,
One thing.
that's it. Okay.
Make sure that everyone has submitted the request for seating for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Even if you place your names on seats in the sanctuary, we are encouraging you to submit the request for High Holy Days.
For the reminder, and also just to let you know, don't forget a week from this Saturday night. Oh my God, it's fully vote. We're gonna have a wonderful service. We're gonna have again, as I've done the last 3 years, a circle at the end, sharing our energy for the blessings for the new year. And we're still looking for anyone who wishes to share a misdeed or something that you did in your life, not recently, doesn't have to be. It can even be during your childhood, and how you rectified it or made up for it. The 2 people giving testimony. And however, if you're going to share something, make sure it's no one in the temple and no one knows what you're talking about. It's not your time to get revenge because that's a sin.
Oh, it's for the service.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks,
And what time is that? Yes.